So Stacy, could you tell us a little bit about why it is that third-party risk has become such a hot-button topic in the marketplace today?
I think there's been a lot of inconsistency in addressing third-party risk over the past several years, and with the heightened sense of risk and the heightened scrutiny from a regulatory perspective, a lot of organizations are reworking how they manage third-party risk.
Could you tell us a little bit more about what risks are associated with working with third parties?
I mean, the biggest thing is you're relying on somebody else to do something, but you can't get rid of the responsibility for it. So as organizations continue to rely on third parties, I think the biggest area is around the reputation risk associated with them. If they have issues related to information that's being used, your customer information or any of your client confidentiality clauses or anything along those lines, if the breach occurs at a third party, the reputation is going to fall back to you as an organization. So I'd say, in addition to the ones that Stacy had highlighted, that's probably one of the primary ones at least that we focus on.
And can you talk a little bit about internal audit's role in managing a risk like reputational risk, as well as others?
So it's one of the fundamental risks that we look at in every aspect of our audit, but particularly related to the third-party risk, we want to make sure that as the framework gets rolled out, right, that they're assessing the inherent risk, especially around the reputational risk with our vendors, and that we're mitigating the risk as best we can and reducing that risk.
You talk about a framework. Can you talk a little bit more about the phases that fall into that framework or that life cycle of third-party risk?
And every organization will tailor their life cycle a little bit differently, but it usually consists of some similar components. The planning piece, where you're deciding on what vendor to use, and then it rolls into some due diligence works where you're looking at the different inherent risks that are out there, just the ones that we just ran through. Then you're looking at, after you do due diligence, going to the contract phase, right? Making sure you put all the right terms and conditions to hold this vendor accountable, making sure there's SLAs in there. And then you go to an ongoing monitoring after you accept them as a vendor and write the contract. And then after the ongoing monitoring stage, you got to make sure that again you're addressing issues and there's escalation. And if you need to figure out your strategy to exit that vendor and or terminate that vendor. Brian, anything else from a
Yeah, no, I mean, as far as the phases, I think that's exactly it, the way that Stacy had highlighted it. And I think, the different activities from an audit perspective would touch on on each of those phases. So when you talked earlier about the risks to auditing these areas, I think a comprehensive program from an internal audit perspective would cover off on each of those phases of the life cycle that Stacy just talked through.
Okay. Is there any phase in that life cycle that you, as an internal auditor, find most difficult or most challenging?
So I'll say we spend more time in two of the areas than the other pieces. We spend more time on the upfront due diligence side, because if you're not making sure you're eliminating the right inherent risks and you got your right controls in place, and then the ongoing monitoring, those are the two pieces that you've got to get right. So from an internal audit perspective, we spend more time auditing those pieces with the first and second line than any other piece.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'd say that probably an area where internal audit probably doesn't spend as much time, or even organizations spend as much time, is on the terminations phase. Is when is it right to get out of a contract? When is it right to terminate a relationship with a vendor? And does internal audit provide the right level of challenge to the business to say, hey, look, we should have exited this relationship months or years ago based on the ongoing monitoring results or the due diligence that was done. So I think that's one of the phases that I would probably highlight where, I know your question was, where does audit focus? But I think that's one of the areas maybe where audit could spend more time, or where they don't spend as much time.
Okay. Getting back to the risks associated with third-party management, can you talk a little bit about the trends around data breaches and how that's obviously contributing a lot to the reputational risks going on in the marketplace?
From information security or cyber security, we've got to make sure our first line of defense teams, right? So in financial services, we refer to ourselves as the first, second, and third line. We've got to make sure that our technology information security teams are going out to the vendors and making sure they have the same exact protocols that we require of our own organizations inside their organizations to make sure they're preventing those data breaches as well.
Yeah, and the other thing I think that's important with regards to data breaches, ensuring that your vendors are communicating to you when they occur, versus you hearing about it in the press, or if you're hearing about it from somebody else. You've got to have the right mechanisms in place to ensure that through the contracting phase or through the due diligence phase that Stacy had talked about, that organizations are being made aware of things that occur, whether they're data breaches, security breaches, lost information, any of those things that present risk to the host company, I think have to be communicated from the third party directly back to your organization, because the last thing you'd want to do is hear about that through the paper or through the news outlets.